A grand archway of a cave opening stood 25 meters above the ground. From the inside, it framed lush green treetops and deep blue sky. Giant stalagmite columns nearly reached the ceiling of an enormous cavern. 18 people were camped here, but this shelter could have accommodated 4 times that many. Forager bands often came to this impressive landmark for short visits during the monsoon season. It was a good place to escape the rain. On this particular afternoon, this group was busy. Some tended fires, which roasted the meat of a wild pig. One woman sat and braided palm leaves to form a basket, and 2 other men sharpened bone arrowheads against rough stones. One boy had been set an especially strenuous task. Near the mouth of the cave, he used a long pointed stick to dig a narrow pit, about as wide as 3 of his hands. Thrusting the stick down, then reaching to pull up loose earth, his sweat mixed with the dirt on his belly. Grandmother kept an eye on his progress from a distance as she butchered a lizard, cutting it open with a small, sharp stone. At one point, they were both distracted by the rustle of leaves above the boy. The movement of branches gave away the presence of a troop of monkeys. Normally, one of the band's hunters would have sprung up, bow in hand, but with boar meat roasting, it wasn't worth it. Once the pit was as deep as his arm was long, the boy picked up a basket filled to the brim with large brown seeds, collected from a pingium tree that morning. Each seed was as long as his middle finger. He tipped half the basket into the pit, then collected several handfuls of ash from an old hearth in the cave. This he dumped into the pit over top the seeds, followed by more seeds, another layer of ash, and a top layer of dirt, leaving behind a small mound. Over the course of many days, the buried seeds would ferment and release the cyanide contained within them. One bite of raw pingium would kill the boy. When the band returned to this cave, he would dig up the seeds, rinse them with water, and safely enjoy their rich, earthy flavor. This boy lived 45,000 years ago in northern Borneo. At only 10 years old, he already possessed a wealth of knowledge about plants and animals. By gaining this information, his ancestors had colonized the rainforest, and his descendants perpetuated his way of life for tens of thousands of years. Welcome to Our Prehistory, Episode 37, Rainforest Adaptations in Asia. The earliest Homo sapiens cultures in Southeast Asia differed from those in the rest of Eurasia in a couple fundamental ways. Their stone tool traditions were more static and consisted of much less systematic approaches to knapping stone. Technological consistency and simplicity in Southeast Asia might have been the result of a relatively stable climate near the equator, or just the outcome of unique approaches toward living in tropical biomes. Today, we will explore in detail how people in Southeast Asia exploited the remarkably diverse resources available at lower latitudes, with a specific interest in groups who lived in and around rainforests. Southeast Asia has provided some of the oldest evidence of human adaptation to this extraordinarily wet ecosystem, revealing which animals people hunted, how they hunted them, which plants they gathered, and how they used them. Most of this information has only come to light in the past couple of decades. Prior to this, many prehistorians believed that human hunter-gatherers were incapable of surviving in rainforests. This idea came from the belief that food, especially food high in carbohydrates, is difficult to obtain in rainforests, despite the high productivity and diversity of this biome. It's true that in an old-growth tropical forest, most of the activity occurs in the canopy, where edible fruits and nuts may be difficult for humans to obtain. The ground level can often be heavily shaded and barren in comparison. Furthermore, even if edible plant material is accessible, roots and seeds often contain toxic chemicals, evolutionary defenses against herbivores. Finally, a significant proportion of animals live entirely in the forest canopy. Tall and dense vegetation, some argue, makes hunting of arboreal animals an insurmountable challenge. The idea that humans can't survive in rainforests has also received support from ethnographers, people who study currently existing cultures. Ethnographic reports have revealed that most hunter-gatherers living in tropical forests today, or in the recent past, trade with farming societies. Often, they receive carbohydrate-rich food items in return for hunted animals. This fact has led to the theory that humankind was only able to colonize the rainforest after the invention of agriculture, aided by goods produced by farmers. Some archaeologists subscribe to this idea, even though evidence of prehistoric human activity has been discovered in modern rainforests, dating to periods before agriculture. They argue, plausibly, that people were only able to survive in those locations because at the time those camps were used, they were actually not found in a rainforest. In fact, there is substantial evidence that wet tropical forests were not as extensive during dry ice ages as they are today. If this theory is correct, it has significant implications for our understanding of our own species. Is it possible that rainforests are anathema to Homo sapiens? If they were indeed a barrier to human movement, how did our ancestors disperse across the wetter tropical regions of the world? This brings us to Southeast Asia, where various biological and geological records show that rainforest used to be much less extensive than it is today. Caves in southern Borneo, Wallacea, and Malaysia harbor prehistoric layers of guano, bat feces, which can be analyzed to determine the type of vegetation that surrounded the caves. In all three cases, grass dominated during the last glacial maximum, around 20,000 years ago, with estimates as high as 90% grass in southern Borneo, indicative of a tropical savanna. These results have led to the idea of a savanna corridor, extending uninterrupted from northern Thailand through the interior of the prehistoric Sunda Peninsula, while rainforest fragments were relegated to the coasts. Proponents of this theory argue that this large grassland served as a prehistoric highway for the movement of our species, an ideal environment for hunting, foraging, and navigating, a landscape more similar to that of East Africa, where Homo sapiens presumably evolved. The savanna corridor theory is used to explain how humans were able to quickly disperse through this region and reach Wallacea and Sahul. To be clear, the existence of a savanna corridor is still unproven because large sections of Southeast Asia lack information about prehistoric vegetation, and we know that rainforest survived in parts of this region. Guano records in northern Borneo, for example, show that forests persisted there even during the driest period of the last ice age. It remains unclear whether savanna formed a continuous corridor or disconnected patches. But what is clear is that in the Pleistocene savannas of Southeast Asia that did exist, humans lived. One archaeological site in northern Thailand shows that more than 30,000 years ago, people lived in a mosaic environment, hunting a combination of forest animals and large herbivores of the savanna, such as bantang and guar, both cattle-like animals. On the island of Java, at the southern margin of Sunda, big game hunters roamed a prehistoric savanna around 35,000 years ago, tracking wild cattle, elephants, and rhinoceros. The idea that humans can't survive in rainforests and required a savanna corridor to enter Southeast Asia is an old idea that remains influential. However, the fact that humans lived in those savannas does not negate the possibility that some also started living in the rainforests of the region, a scenario which has recently gained support through new archaeological and ethnographic studies. This research suggests that the difficulty of obtaining food in rainforests has been previously exaggerated, and presents examples of both modern and prehistoric peoples that successfully did this. On the ethnographic side, re-evaluations of hunter-gatherers living in the rainforests of New Guinea, the Congo Basin, Malaysia, and Borneo suggests that even if they sometimes trade with farmers, they do have the capacity to survive exclusively on wild resources, in particular by foraging tubers like yams and the inner stems of sago palms. Interestingly, it was found that the Penan people of Borneo actively manage the wild population of sago palm by replanting. In addition to rainforest cultures that have persisted into the modern day, we now have strong evidence that foraging in this type of ecosystem extends deep into prehistoric times, including by some of the first Homo sapiens to inhabit Southeast Asia. That evidence is what we will explore in this episode. From the remains of plants and animals left behind at camps, to pollen records and the chemical composition of human bones, recent research is dispelling the notion that rainforests were a barrier to our species. These results raise the question, does our species really have an innate affinity for grasslands? Or could we just as comfortably occupy the dark understory below towering rainforest trees? Meat was a key resource in prehistoric societies, offering vital protein and fat. Skilled hunters obtained prestige within their band by sharing their bounty with others. The ability to hunt, trap, or fish effectively was a precondition for survival in any ecosystem, including rainforests. The first groups of Homo sapiens to arrive in Southeast Asia from the Indian subcontinent were accustomed to hunting gazelle and antelope in relatively dry landscapes. Entering more humid terrain, they encountered a different set of animals. Those who ventured into the forest found that much of the fauna climbed through the treetops, 20 to 50 meters above the ground. These animals, adapted to navigating dense vegetation, were generally smaller than those of open environments, most weighing less than 20 kilograms. This fact might have challenged the newcomers. Throughout Eurasia, Homo sapiens successfully expanded its range by targeting large grassland herbivores. This was the logical approach. Given a certain amount of time, a hunter will obtain more meat when pursuing larger animals than smaller ones. Large game hunting was efficient. As some groups made the choice to live in the rainforest, their way of life had to change. They had no option but to pursue small animals. One potential result of this is that people spent a greater amount of time hunting per day to obtain the same amount of meat as groups living in a grassland. Alternatively, rainforest settlers could have chosen to eat less meat and compensate with more plant food. Or perhaps they adopted new technologies that made hunting, trapping, and fishing more efficient. It's hard to know for sure which approach the first inhabitants of Southeast Asia took, but some insights emerge by examining the discarded animal bones at their camps. These bones reveal that the first rainforest foragers did not exclusively hunt small arboreal animals. Even in heavily forested areas, they stalked and killed some relatively large terrestrial creatures. The most important were sambar deer and various species of wild pig, both of which live in forests. Sambar deer, common prey in Thailand and Malaysia during the Pleistocene, weigh between 100 and 350 kilograms as adults, and were likely hunted with spears or bows and arrows. Interestingly, one study suggested that in northern Borneo, boars were primarily trapped, possibly with noose or pit traps, because both adult and juvenile bones were discovered among the camp refuse. Juveniles were not likely to have been targeted in a hunt. To a lesser extent, Homo sapiens living during the Ice Age hunted bovines of the forest, such as the dwarf buffalo on the island of Sulawesi. Despite the availability of large terrestrial prey, comprehensive studies of animal remains at prehistoric camps demonstrate that people in Southeast Asia depended on a wide diversity of smaller animals for a large proportion of their diet. In Thailand and Malaysia, people living during the Pleistocene systematically gathered, hunted, or trapped freshwater mollusks, turtles, tortoises, and tiny muntjac deer. Occasionally, they also ate monkeys, flying squirrels, porcupines, monitor lizards, snails, rats, birds, and fish. In certain places where forest cover remained especially dense, such as northern Borneo, monkeys and cat-like civets were more common prey, and both were primarily found in the treetops. Here, even orangutans were hunted at times. Human colonists of rainforests would have had to adopt a broad range of tactics to capture and kill many of these small animals, from shooting highly accurate and powerful projectiles, such as arrows, for arboreal mammals, to simpler methods such as trapping, netting, clubbing, or even catching by hand. Finally, key information about early rainforest hunter-gatherers in Asia also comes from the southern tip of the Indian subcontinent, from Sri Lanka, where a small area of rainforest was inhabited for tens of thousands of years, starting 50,000 years ago. Here, people mastered hunting animals high above ground. Monkeys were their main target, with wild pigs, giant squirrels, civets, and mongooses also common prey. They complemented those with snails, fish, snakes, lizards, and a miniature species of deer. This Sri Lankan diet, a rainforest diet including a wide range of mostly small animals, some arboreal, resembles that of Southeast Asia, and further east, that of Pleistocene hunters in New Guinea, where marsupials, including tree kangaroos and possum-like cuscus, were common prey. These findings suggest that in rainforests, humans created broad-spectrum economies, something which in more northerly latitudes tended to be associated with the more recent terminal Pleistocene and Holocene. Based on the entirety of the bone remains from Southeast Asia, Sri Lanka, and New Guinea, there is clear evidence that while some of the first humans to reach these areas hunted large herbivores in savannas, others camped in the rainforest for extended periods. The extent to which some bands of foragers became forest specialists has been revealed by chemical analysis of their teeth, specifically the ratio of carbon isotopes. This type of analysis can distinguish whether a person ate food that came from closed forest, open grasslands, or a mixture of the two. In open grasslands, plants using the C4 type of photosynthesis predominate, resulting in a small difference in the ratio of carbon-12 and carbon-13 isotopes in those plants and animals that eat those plants. Analyses of human teeth from northern Thailand found that people were primarily eating forest food, with only minor contributions from grasslands, suggesting that despite living around an ecotonal border, they spent more time in rainforest. In Sri Lanka, a similar analysis revealed an even more specialized lifeway, with the entire human diet coming from rainforest plants and animals, indicating year-long occupation of this ecosystem. So in sum, we have strong evidence that rainforests of Southeast Asia were colonized by Homo sapiens more than 40,000 years ago. As forager bands transformed from grassland nomads to forest people, many aspects of their life must have changed, from their migration patterns to their tools. We saw last episode that stone tools became simplified as our species moved from India to Southeast Asia. Hoa Binyan Sumatralis were the only standardized form, possibly used for woodworking, but there were other technological innovations made in the forest. Evidence for those changes comes primarily from two places: the Naya system of caves in northern Borneo and 3 caves in Sri Lanka. These archaeological sites have provided a wealth of information about rainforest lifeways during the Pleistocene. In both Naya and Sri Lanka, monkeys were hunted in large numbers, making up about 15% of the bones at Naya and 35% in Sri Lanka. Importantly, only prime age adults were killed, meaning that hunters had the ability to target specific individual monkeys. Alongside these animal bones, archaeologists have discovered fragments of weapons, presumably used to hunt monkeys and other animals. These artifacts were narrow bone points, believed to have been the tips of arrows, propelled by bows. These date back to 32,000 years ago at Naya and 45,000 years ago in Sri Lanka. In both places, the points were carefully carved and polished to tapered points. The Naya points were longer, often around 12 centimeters, than those from Sri Lanka, which ranged from 2 to 4 centimeters. The bases were often notched to aid the attachment of the point to an arrow shaft. In some cases, marks made by string used in the binding can still be seen. In Sri Lanka, these artifacts demonstrate some of the complexity that existed in the organic toolkit of rainforest hunters. Here, bone points came in 3 varieties, which archaeologists call unipoints, bipoints, and geometric points. Unipoints were only pointed at one end, similar to those made at Naya. Bipoints and geometrics, on the other hand, were pointed at both ends, with the geometrics being shorter and shaped like triangles or rhombuses. The functions of these distinct types are unknown, but geometrics could have been fishing gorges or barbs on arrows, similar to the geometric microliths that they made from stone. Beyond bows and arrows, we don't know much about other tools developed to suit rainforest life. In Sri Lanka, people sometimes sharpened the canine teeth of monkeys to make awls. And in Malaysia and Borneo, boar tusks were fashioned into curved knives. In recent times, monkeys have been hunted using blowpipes and poison-tipped darts. However, no evidence of Ice Age blowpipes has yet been found. Even though bone arrowheads have only been found at a handful of Pleistocene sites, the fact that they were used in 2 isolated locations where specialized rainforest ways of life are well documented suggests that this weapon was essential. Even though wooden spears, traps, and human hands served to capture prey on the ground, mastery of the bow extended the reach of our species into the treetops. Recent reports about prehistoric rainforest societies in Sri Lanka, Borneo, and New Guinea have revealed that these geographically distant cultures shared a similar way of life. One group of archaeologists has coined the term rainforest package to describe a set of practices linking these peoples. Evidence of these customs is still scarce and requires discoveries at new sites to determine how common they were. But the rainforest package seems to include some elements we have already learned about. The hunting of both arboreal and terrestrial animals using bone-pointed arrows, and a reliance on simple, amorphous stone tools. To this set, we can add another tradition, which might have been essential to survival in tropical forests. Mastery in the use of a wide variety of plant species for food and tools, sometimes involving human management of the natural environment. Evidence for this again comes primarily from Sri Lanka and Borneo, and challenges the old idea that the absence of carbohydrate-rich food prevents full-time human occupation of rainforests. More than 40,000 years ago, people in Sri Lanka left behind charred remains of roasted breadfruit next to their campfires, along with pieces of canarium nuts and wild banana. At the Naya caves, foragers gathered seeds of pangium and canarium trees, stems of sago palm, and tubers, including yams and taro. Several of these plants are starchy and good sources of carbohydrates, although some are toxic to humans if eaten raw. Early colonists of the rainforest must have developed the knowledge necessary to detoxify these plants, techniques developed over the course of several generations of trial and error. Some of the toxins in these plants can be neutralized by boiling, roasting, soaking, or leaching. In fact, evidence of leaching has been found within the Naya caves, where its inhabitants dug pits and filled them with ash and pangium seeds. Over several weeks, this method brings out the toxic compounds from the seeds, yielding a highly nutritious food. Similar pits containing charcoal were discovered at a cave in Sri Lanka, suggesting that an analogous technique had been developed. The gathering of rainforest tubers and nuts in Sri Lanka and Borneo is mirrored by the early activities of the foragers who colonized New Guinea more than 40,000 years ago, reinforcing the idea that the use of those resources was a repeated component of life in tropical forests. Another interesting phenomenon occurred following the colonization of Borneo and New Guinea by Homo sapiens. In both places, forest fires increased in frequency after the arrival of humans. In New Guinea, widespread layers of charcoal hint at this trend, and at Naya Cave in Borneo, pollen belonging to a plant known to grow prolifically after fire suddenly appears alongside human tools. Although we can't say for sure, some archaeologists have interpreted this as the result of intentional, human-caused burning, designed to maintain open areas at the margin of the forest. This practice could have achieved several desired results, from removing cover for annoying insects to creating an ideal habitat for preferred prey animals, or providing sunlight to plants that produced nutritious tubers. Foragers may have been manipulating nature to create more food. If this was indeed a widespread practice, then habitat at the edge of rainforests may have been key to human survival in the wet tropics, giving some credence to the idea that hunting and gathering exclusively under a closed forest canopy may have been difficult. Extending our search for evidence of plant use out from Sri Lanka and Naya into other parts of Southeast Asia, we don't find any more examples of preserved fragments of nuts, tubers, or fruit. But in a few cases, microscopic plant residue has been detected on stone tools, mostly the result of people processing plant fibers for the crafting of other items, such as string or baskets. For example, on the tiny Talaud Islands of Wallacea, 35,000-year-old stone tools bore fibers from the stems of wild banana plants, a material used among local cultures today to make string. Similar findings have come from Pleistocene-aged sites in the Philippines, Sulawesi, and Borneo. Interestingly, at two sites, stone flakes bearing wide notches were the preferred implement for this task. It's theorized that they were used to thin the fibers, a process to make plant material more flexible and soft. Furthermore, at various prehistoric camps, palm leaf residue suggests that mats or baskets were frequently woven from fronds of these plants. Whereas people living in colder climates had become expert workers of animal skins to create well-fitted warm clothing, the earliest inhabitants of rainforests probably became skilled workers of plant material, creating an array of functional items. The extent to which plants were more important to the early hunter-gatherers of tropical forests than other ecosystems is still up for debate. We know that the inhabitants of Europe ate berries, nuts, and tubers, made string from plant material, and sometimes even wove fabrics. It's currently impossible to estimate the proportion of Pleistocene diets composed of plants in different parts of the world. However, what might make the use of plants in tropical forests unique is the degree to which people had to alter the natural condition of these plants, whether it be through detoxification of food or clearing of forest patches. The earliest rainforest cultures are only now starting to emerge from the mist of prehistory through archaeological research. Glimpses into this past suggest that these societies, often separated and likely not in contact with each other, developed certain similar customs. More than 40,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers lived full-time in the rainforest by processing plants to make them edible, and by hunting arboreal mammals with bows and arrows. Some groups made stone axes, like the Sumatraliths of the Hoa Binyan or wasted axes of New Guinea, but mostly they relied on simple stone tools. This new understanding has discredited the idea that our species was incapable of surviving in tropical forests before agriculture. Stable rainforest societies and their traditions persisted for tens of thousands of years. People returned to both Naya and Sri Lankan caves millennia after millennia, hunting and gathering the same animals and plants, using the same types of stone tools and bone-pointed arrows. These findings have changed our understanding of prehistory. Rainforest was not a major barrier to the dispersal of our species in Southeast Asia or other parts of the world. Homo sapiens was not innately maladapted to this rainy biome. Instead, much like the extreme environment of the cold mammoth steppe, humans quickly overcame the obstacles to survival in this unique tropical ecosystem. Rainforest people were not temporary occupants of a marginal habitat, but permanent denizens of the hot, wet, biologically diverse places on our planet. In our next episode, we will move away from the economic and technological aspects of hunter-gatherer life and explore symbolic expression in South and Southeast Asia through the medium of rock art. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider becoming a patron of the show. Your support will allow me to continue bringing you our prehistory.